Please be seated. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." A few months after his election as Pope in 2013, Pope Francis gave an interview to an Italian Jesuit magazine. And in the interview, he was asked, "What kind of church do you dream of?" And Pope Francis replied, "I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he or she has high cholesterol or to talk about the level of their blood sugars. You have to heal the person's wounds. Then we talk about everything else. Heal the wounds. Heal the wounds." And this, of course, is an attractive and compelling mission for the church. It reminds us of Jesus in today's gospel reading, who makes a real difference in people's lives by healing them. But how exactly does healing happen in the church? And I think answering this question is important because it goes to the heart of whether there's any point in coming to a place like the cathedral, besides the reason you go to any other museum. You know, it's beautiful, it's in the guidebooks, something you do in New York. Because despite what Pope Francis has said in his inspiring humility, and in the Episcopal Church, despite our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, now super world famous, and his inspiring preaching, church attendance in the West continues to decline. Clearly, people do not find the church to be a place of healing. Frankly, they find it probably irrelevant. And so how does healing happen in the church? Now, as some of you know, I grew up in Northern California, the child of Korean immigrants. And in some ways, my family was very typical immigrant family. I had relatives who owned little businesses, a dry cleaner, a grocery store, a cafe. And the cafe is actually where I worked many summers, washing dishes, peeling potatoes, and things like that. But in other ways, my parents were actually not at all typical Korean immigrants. My parents, frankly, were kind of hippies. And my father's hippiedom, if you can call it that, was manifest in his real suspicion of doctors. He hated doctors. And he thought that if he just ate the right food, if he just ate organic food, and this is well before the organic food revolution, that he would be just fine. And so one day, when I was about 8, he got a cut on his finger. And he washed it and he put a Band-Aid, and it was a cut. He was going to be fine. But a few days later, he was not fine. The finger started getting bigger. And he had to take the Band-Aid off because it wouldn't fit, and he was clearly in pain. But he said, "No, I'm fine. I just need to drink a few more smoothies, and I'll be fine." And you could see, day by day, the finger it was red, and then dark red, and then it started turning green. It actually turned green. And my mother at that point said, "You are going to the doctor. I don't care what you think." And he agreed, and he went, and they had to have surgery, and he was actually very lucky that his finger didn't have to be amputated. And so he came to a point in his life when he realized, you know what? It doesn't matter what kind of smoothies I drink. I actually today need a doctor. And in that one way, my father shared something very similar with the woman in today's gospel story. They both realized they were really sick and they needed help. I mean, if you think about this poor woman in this story, for 12 years, she has this horrible bleeding, these horrible hemorrhages. And no one can cure her. And she spends all her money going to doctor and probably these quacks back then also, and no one can fix her. And even worse than being sick, in Leviticus it says, if you have the kind of bleeding that this woman has, you're not just sick, you are impure. You are considered ritually impure by your society. And so in addition to being sick, this poor woman she probably thought to herself, maybe I have some self-loathing. Maybe she also hated herself because I'm kind of unclean. Everyone is telling me, my religious tradition is telling me, I'm not just sick, but I'm unclean, I'm impure. And so of course she's going to go to Jesus when she hears about him. Why not? Everything else has failed. And notice how she approaches Jesus. She's in the crowd, but then she has to step forward and no longer just be a spectator and grab a hold of him. And she probably thought, if this Jesus guy is the real deal, then all I need to do is just touch him. And I'm so desperate, I'll try anything. I'll even try that. I'll even try stepping out of this crowd and thereby making my illness and sickness obvious to everyone. And so she does. She steps out, she touches Jesus, and she's healed. But what about the rest of the crowd? There are a lot of people there. Were they healed? I mean, didn't they want to be healed too? And I'm not sure. Because the text tells us that there are so many people crowding up around Jesus that everyone is touching him. In fact, his disciples are incredulous when Jesus says, "Who touched me?" They say, "How can you ask that question? Everyone is touching you." But it's only the woman who steps out of the crowd and intentionally seeks Jesus and grabs a hold of him who is healed. That's the point that Jesus loses his power. So I'm not convinced that all those other people crowding around, inadvertently touching Jesus, were actually healed. I don't think anything happened to them. And it reminds me of the people who come to the cathedral, the crowds that come at Christmas and Easter. Maybe these people crowding around Jesus had just heard about this guy, and they wanted to watch the spectacle. And often, a large crowd, it attracts a crowd. And so maybe they weren't going to step out of the crowd. Maybe they're just going to hang back and watch. They want to watch the show. They don't need to come out and grab a hold of Jesus. They don't need to. They feel just fine. Thank you. And so here's the thing. If the church is going to be a field hospital for anyone, it needs patients. But patients are people who can admit that they're sick. They are like the woman in our gospel story today. They are like my father. They've come to a point where they can no longer deny that they actually need help. So how does healing happen in the church? Well, first, to be healed, you have to admit you're sick. And I think if we do this, if we actually can admit to ourselves, I'm not doing so well, I think our life can change in a few ways. And let me give you a couple examples. If someone really criticizes you and they really hurt your feelings because it's a mean criticism and it's totally unfair, and you are so angry and you're ready to fight back and you're going to cut them down and make them hurt, just like they made you hurt, I want you to remember, you're also sick. And if you can remember that, maybe you can say to them, critic, buddy, if you really knew who I was, if you really knew my soul, you'd have actually many more things to criticize about me, because I'm really sick. And if someone says to you, people always say this to me, "Oh, church, I'm not going to go to church, they're all a bunch of hypocrites there." You can say, "Yeah, and we have room for one more. Actually, this cathedral has room for thousands more hypocrites. To join all of you hypocrites. To join this hypocrite right here preaching from this pulpit. We got room. Come on in." Finally, and this idea I took from this old kind of conservative Presbyterian pastor, Steve Brown. I really have nothing in common with this man, especially theologically. But he had this idea that I like and I'm adapting. He said, maybe the best way to show the healing power of Jesus in church would be to serve alcohol in church. And not just little glasses of wine, but to have an open bar. Let's have an open bar and let people get totally wasted. And then when we're all good and drunk, we tell our deepest secrets to each other publicly. And if we did that, at least we could start being real with each other in church. We could finally stop pretending that church is about being good or being fixed or trying to fix the world or fix ourselves. And we could actually realize church is about realizing how sick we are and that none of the other remedies we've tried have worked to heal us. We could admit that, we're so desperate for healing. I'm going to try anything. I'll even step out of this crowd, and I'm going to grab onto Jesus for dear life. And if we did that, Jesus would forgive all the drinking. Heck, Jesus has actually already forgiven all your deepest secrets. You don't even have to ask for forgiveness. It's already happened. And yet, you know what? I know that's totally unfair, and it doesn't actually make a lot of sense to me either. And of course, that would be a horrible way to structure our legal system. I agree, but guess what? You're still forgiven, and so am I, and Jesus loves us anyway. All we have to do is stop pretending that we're so fine, and that unconditional and healing love of Jesus is ours. What's interesting about the field hospital system, actually, is that it really developed during the Civil War. That's actually one of the great achievements of the war. There were so many wounded and dead that we needed to figure out a way to heal them effectively. And there were so many wounded because we had all this new technology like the rifled cannons, so we could kill each other with incredible efficiency. And today we're living at a time when people say, really sober, serious historians and political scientists say, our country is being divided. And we haven't seen this level of division since the Civil War. And so maybe if we're going to be the field hospital, if the church will be the field hospital for our day, maybe the first step to bringing healing to the world is admitting that, we're all sick. Not just that group over there who supports that administration that is obviously horrible, that those are clearly sick people, but that we are all sick. And if we start from there, a place of acknowledging our own faults and being so grateful that God loves us anyway. He loves us broken down, imperfect people anyway. Maybe we can take some of God's love and share it with our enemies, especially our political enemies. And maybe in this way we can bring a little healing to our broken nation.